David Nutt is a psychiatrist and as director of the Neuropsychopharmacology Unit in the Division of Brain Sciences at Imperial College London, he's one of the country's leading researchers into the effects of drugs on the brain. He caused controversy after saying horse riding is more dangerous than ecstasy and was famously sacked from his government role as chair of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs after criticising the government's decision to reclassify cannabis as a more harmful Class B drug. But he's less famous for his extensive research into how drugs work and what they do in the brain. And it's this that he really wants science to focus on. Without it, he says, we may be missing out on their potential benefits. They could be a source of new treatments for conditions like depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. His current research, funded by the Medical Research Council, involves assessing the effects of magic mushrooms as a possible treatment for depression. Not surprisingly, securing funding for this kind of research isn't easy. Well, at the end of this month, a TV first will be broadcast. His research into the effects of ecstasy with volunteers taking the drug while being monitored in a brain scanner. A piece of research funded by and soon to be broadcast on Channel 4. Professor David Nutt, welcome to The Life Scientific.
Thank you, Jim.
Now, it was only once you'd started studying natural sciences at Cambridge that you realised you then wanted to switch to medicine. Why people? Why were you so interested in wanting to study people as opposed to sort of broader science in general?
I remember coming home from school one day and talking to my father. He said, you should read this. And it was the account by Albert Hofmann of how he discovered LSD and how he'd accidentally pipetted the drug into his mouth. He was looking for a drug to treat, I think, dementia or stroke. And then he describes how cycling home from his laboratory, it seemed to take forever, hours and hours and hours, even though it only took about 20 minutes. And it was such a bizarre thing. How can a drug change your complete sense of time? And I remember that distinctly thinking, that's fascinating because maybe drugs can change other things, not just a sense of time. Maybe they can change, your sense of thinking or feeling, etc. And that was the beginning of my interest in pharmacology of the brain.
So you went to Cambridge to study natural sciences, but you switched to medicine because that then allowed you to study people. And did you think at this point, I want to be a doctor or I want to be a psychiatrist? Your early interest in brain science, it seems to be taking you down that path of psychiatry.
Well, I wanted to be a researcher on the brain.
Right.
And then I got interested in psychiatry and brain processes underlying disorders like schizophrenia. As a medical student, I went and did my elective. I didn't go to Africa or South America, where most people went. I went down the road to New Cross to do community psychiatry because I wanted to learn more about it.
And how did you find it?
I found it quite challenging. Going from sort of books to the reality of clinical practice was quite tough. In a way, it almost sort of put me off psychiatry because it just seemed to me that the challenges were so enormous. The vastness of psychiatry was actually going to be something very difficult to really, in my lifetime, kind of grapple with and get on top of. And I thought, well, maybe it's just too big an issue, both the brain and society, so maybe I'll retreat a bit and just try to solve some of the brain questions first.
So your interest in people and mental health was undiminished, but you now felt strongly that the way to do it was to understand more about the workings of the brain and improve psychiatry that way.
Yes, but always being aware of the fact that when we treat people with psychiatric disorders, largely we use medication, we use drugs. So it always seemed to me if we understood the drugs, we could not only improve on treatment, but we might also understand the underlying problems in the brain that the drugs were working on. So the drugs, in a sense, are a clue to what's going on in the brain.
And it was while you were training in a lab in Oxford, where the ethos was to bring scientific understanding back into psychiatry, that you worked together with Phil Cowan. One story gives insight into your approach to research at that time.
David was always very keen to be first in line to try out new interventions, and we were interested then in the effects of the mood-stabilizing drug lithium. And to study this, David had been taking lithium for several days, and he was lying on a bed in one of our testing rooms, and I had just connected him to an intravenous drip. And this had been made up by pharmacy with a preservative in, so it had rather a disconcerting green colour. So the whole procedure had rather a gothic tinge to it. And we were visited on this day by Michael Gelder, who was the awesomely knowledgeable and distinguished professor of psychiatry, a man of some prudence, who sometimes worried about what David was up to. And when Michael saw what was going on, he wasn't completely happy, drew me out of the testing room and said, "Do you think we should be doing this? After all, we don't know what's going to happen." And this was followed by David's voice from inside the testing room saying, "That's why it's called research, Michael."
Has that approach to research continued in your lab? Do you or colleagues still take part in self-experimentation?
I don't anymore. I'm too old. I'm too overweight. And also, over the years, I've volunteered myself many times. And my colleagues say, "Trouble you, Dave, you're not normal enough."
You are, David Nutt, currently Director of Neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College London. Your research is essentially to find out more about how drugs work in the brain. Let's just be clear, we're talking about all drugs here, regardless of their legality.
That's correct. I mean, I'm interested in any drug that changes the brain in a way which could help us have insights into both mental illness and also fundamental brain processes.
And how much is there that we still don't know about the workings of the brain?
We don't even know what we don't know. I'm still not entirely sure we even know the alphabet with which to write the questions about the brain. We are approaching the brain in a very structured, logical way using current technology, but I'm still not sure we're actually addressing the questions, the fundamental questions about it, because I don't know if we actually know what the questions are.
Well, it's your particular approach in research to improving psychiatry that has been admired by colleagues. So here's Phil Cowan again.
He's a very original thinker. He sees the value of understanding the neurobiological basis of mental health problems and using that to help move treatment on. Because he's a very persuasive and intelligent person, I think his opinion has carried a lot of weight at a time when psychiatry tends to be going down a rather demedicalized route and not really using the scientific innovations that it might to try and improve things.
One such innovation, indeed one of your most important scientific discoveries, was finding out how psychedelic drugs work. Can you explain what that discovery was and why was it so surprising?
Really, since reading that report of Hoffman when I was a teenager, I've been intrigued to know why a drug like LSD could produce such fundamental alterations in perceptual experiences in the brain. And so, relatively recently, we decided it would be of great interest to take a short-acting psychedelic, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, and use that to ask this question. What do these drugs do? And I'd assumed that certainly the alterations that you see in people taking those sorts of drugs, so they get hallucinations, they get a lot of interesting sort of kaleidoscopic visual illusions or hallucinations, that they would be associated with increases in brain function. So we did the study, and what we found was completely contrary to our expectation. Significant parts of the brain switched off under psilocybin, didn't switch on. That was kind of amazing because we really had never seen an experiment where you just switched off parts of the brain.
You do imagine that a psychedelic drug like LSD, which sets the brain off into overdrive, is turning things on, not closing things down.
That's right. And then when we looked in more detail at where these changes occurred in the brain, the major changes occurred in parts of the brain which actually integrate brain function. So we then began to think, well, maybe what's going on is that what these drugs are doing is taking out the normal control mechanisms of the brain and allowing other parts of the brain to sort of do things that they're normally constrained from doing.
What do you mean by integrate function?
So the brain is obviously a really complex organ, and it has to integrate visual function, auditory function. There are many different activities the brain does, but they have to be coordinated in order for us to work optimally. And that coordination seems to be produced by certain parts of the brain. And those brain regions link together in a very sophisticated way so that they essentially orchestrate or allow optimal brain function. Dampening those down, as psilocybin does, seems therefore to disconnect hearing and seeing. And so people get these perceptual distortions because they're no longer constrained in the standard way. So you get disconnects. And those disconnects essentially are that sense of disorganization, of perceptual changes, of time changes, and also, very importantly, in relation to where we might want to go with this, where we are going in a way, changes in thinking. Because what it turns out is that that particular region of the brain, this default mode network, it's overactive in mental illness, particularly in depression, and to some extent less well studied in PTSD. So people who have those disorders seem to have them because they over-engage those brain regions in thinking either bad thoughts if they're depressed or worry about the trauma if they've got PTSD. So that system seems to become overactive, and we thought, wow, we're turning it off. Maybe this could be therapeutic. And then we looked at the literature on depression, and we looked at other experiments, for instance, using meditation and using electroconvulsive therapy for depression. And it seems that all these different approaches turn off those regions. So we thought, well, hey, maybe psilocybin could be useful like those other approaches.
That's the active ingredient in
LSD. Psilocybin is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. So we said, well, we can turn off these regions just like other treatments of depression. Let's see if it works clinically. So we went to the Medical Research Council and said, this is seriously off the wall kind of approach.
But quite let's give it a go. Isn't it? I mean, it's counterintuitive, I guess.
Totally counterintuitive. That clinical trial is now being set up, and not easy to do, and we're still wrestling with all the ethical and practical issues. But at least it's potentially a completely novel way of dealing with problems like depression.
So this kind of research isn't just giving us insights into how the brain works. It really is providing a potential avenue for therapy for treating mental illness.
Yes, and that's what that kind of integration of fundamental neuroscience, that's what I've always wanted to do.
And of course, I think, we have to be clear at this point, you're not advocating that you're not encouraging people to self-medicate in order to treat conditions they may have.
Not at all, no. I think it's important that we do these experiments, and then if they are positive, we're going to have to get it available into medicine. And that's going to be difficult because, just to be clear about this, because these drugs are illegal, people find it very, very hard to work on them. The regulations are enormously intense. And one of the paradoxes is if psilocybin does work in our hands, doctors won't be able to use it because most doctors won't have the resources, the monetary resources and the time to actually organise themselves to be able to keep the drug and use the drug. So my parallel ambitions is to try to change the law to make it a bit easier for people to use these drugs for research and hopefully for therapy.
What specific hurdles have you had to overcome to get funding for this particular study?
So the depression study?
Yes.
We've got to get ethics from the health authorities. We've got to get sponsorship from the universities. We've got to find a source of the drug somewhere in the world which complies with medical manufacturing quality. We've got to get the licenses to hold the drug. Another major point, which we shouldn't forget, is that actually accessing the drug is very difficult. Very few people manufacture it because the chore of complying with the regulations means that most companies just can't be bothered.
Well, you've got round some of these sorts of difficulties by receiving funding from an unusual source, Channel 4. They've recently funded one of your latest projects.
That's right, yes. So having failed to get funding from what you might call conventional funders to work on MDMA ecstasy, we were approached by Channel 4 to see if we were interested in working with them to produce a science documentary around drug use. And we had an interesting discussion, and this was done from my new charity, the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs. And we discussed, quite frankly, with them, what would be an interesting study to do and show as a scientific program. And I persuaded them that it should be MDMA. Because I think that is the most interesting drug. It's widely used, and we know virtually nothing about what it does in the brain. And given that it was originally being used for psychotherapeutic purposes, it was originally called empathy, and it was widely used in the USA by therapists helping couples deal with marital breakdown. And then kids started using it, and the name changed from empathy to ecstasy. And no one has done an imaging study. No one has actually found out what ecstasy does in the brain, why it makes people feel empathetic, why kids like to use it.
Of course, we should say there have been high-profile headline cases where people have died from taking ecstasy. And it's those sort of stories that really...
Yes, but you need to look at this in the round. I mean, over the last 40 years,